ॐ ब्रह्मानन्दं परमसुखदं केवलं ज्ञानमूर्तिं द्वन्द्वातीतं गगनसदृशं तत्त्वमसि आदिलक्ष्यम् एकं नित्यं विमलमचलं सर्वधी साक्षीभूतम् भावतीतं त्रिगुणरहितं सद्गुरुं तं नमः. Shivoham friends, let us continue our session of Yoga Vasishtha Maharamayana Utpatti Khanda and chapter 101, in which another story is going to be told. And in this story there is an old nurse which makes up a story of three princes for a boy. Ramji said, "Tell me, O chief of sages, the story of the boy that illustrates the mind." Vasishtha replied, "Hear me, Ram. Tell you the tale of a silly and stupid boy who once asked his nurse to recite some pretty story for his amusement. With a pleased face and with an accent as sweet as honey, the nurse began to relate her fine wrote story for the pleasure of the boy. Once upon a time, in a desolate country, there were three high-minded and fortunate young princes, noted for their virtues and valor. They shone in what vast desolate land resembling the spacious sky, like stars reflected in the expanse of waters below. Two of them were unforgotten. Two of them were unbegotten and uncreated, and the third was not born of a mother's womb. Once it happened that these three went out together from their dreary abode to find a better place to live. They had no other companion with them, and they were sad in their minds and long faces, as if they were exiled from their native country. Having left that desert land, they set out with their faces looking forward and proceeded onward like the three planets, Mercury, Venus, and Jupiter, in their conjunction. Their bodies, delicate as shirisha flowers, were scorched by the powerful sun shining on their backs. On their way, they were dried by the heat of the summer day, like wilted leaves on trees. Their lotus-like feet were signed by the burning sands of their desert path, and they cried aloud, like some other tender fawns, straying from their herd, crying, "O Father, save us." The soles of their feet were bruised by the blades of grass, and the joints of their bodies were weakened by the heat of the sun. Their fair forms were covered with dust flying from the grounds on their lonely journey. They saw a clump of three trees by the wayside, braided with tufts of spikes upon them, and loaded with fruits and flowers hanging down. They were a refuge for birds and desert animals resting above and around them. The first two of these trees didn't grow wild, and the third, which was easy to climb, bore no seeds to produce other plants in future. Under the shade of these trees, the three princes were refreshed from the fatigue of their journey. They halted there like the three gods, Indra, Vayu, and Yam, under the thick shady branches of the Parijat tree of paradise. They ate the ambrosial fruits of these trees. They drank their nectar juice to their fill, and after decorating themselves with gulunka garlands, they resumed their journey. Having gone a long way, around midday, they came to a confluence of three rivers, flowing with rapid currents and swelling waves. One of these was a dry channel, and the other two were shallow with little water in them. They looked like the blinded eyeballs of blind men. The princes, wet with perspiration, bathed joyfully in the almost dried up channel, just like the three gods, Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, washed their sweating limbs in the clear stream of the Ganges. They played along while in the water and drank it, which was as sweet as milk, and cheered their spirits with full satisfaction of their hearts. They resumed their journey at the end of the day. After about sunset, they arrived at their future home, a newly built city standing far away from the height of the hill. There were rows of flags fluttering like lotuses in the clear lake of the blue sky. The loud noise of the songs of the citizen was heard at distance. Here they saw three beautiful and good-looking houses, with turrets of gold and gems shining afar, like the peaks of Mount Meru under the blazing sun. Two of these were not the works of art, and the third was without foundation. At last, the three princes entered the last of these. They entered this house and sat and walked about with happy faces. Inside, they chanced upon three pots as bright as gold. The first two broke into pieces upon their lifting, and the third was reduced to dust as it touched. The far-sighted princes, however, took up the dust and made a new pot with it. It means that though these sheets are as volatile as air, yet it is possible to employ the vital principle of action. Then these gluttonous princes use the pot to cook a large quantity of rice for their food, amounting to 100 bushels minus one, enough to live on for their whole lifetime. The princes then invited three Brahmins, and these three Brahmins were childhood, youth, and age, to the food prepared by them. Two of whom, childhood and youth, were bodiless, and the third, old age, has no mouth with which to eat. The mouthless Brahmin took 100 bushels of the rice and ate it up because he had devoured the child and the youth. The princes took the remainder of the Brahmin's food for their meal, which was nothing. The three princes, having refreshed themselves with the traces of Brahmin's food, took their rest in the same house of their next home. Then went out on their journey to hunt for new home, and which is repeated reincarnations. Thus, I have related to you, Ram, the entire story of the boy and princess. Now consider its significance well in your mind, and you will become wise thereby. After the nurse finished telling her pretty parable, the boy seemed happy with what he had heard. I have told you this story, O Ram, in connection with my lecture on the subject of the mind. The story serves to explain how the mind fabricates this imaginary being of the world, this air-built castle of the world, which has come to be taken for a reality, is like the story of the body, only a false fabrication from the old nurse's imagination. It is the representation of the various thoughts and ideas of our minds that exhibits themselves to view according to our notions of them in our states of bondage and liberation. Nothing really exists except the creation of our imagination. It is our fancy that fashions all the objects in their peculiar fantastic forms. The heavens, earth, sky and air, and also the rivers, mountains, and the sides and quarters of the sky. All are creations of our fancy, like the visions in our dreams that join and disjoin and fashion scenes in their fantastic forms. Like the princes and the rivers and future city were mere creation of nurse's imagination. In the same way, the existence of the visible world is only the product of man's imaginative power. Imaginative power manifests all things all around. Like moving water shows the rise and falls of the waves in the sea. It gives a shape of airy nothing. It is the power of apprehending ideas and combining them into new forms and combinations. The imaginative power of God raised the idea of things in his omniscient and all comprehensive soul. These ideals afterward manifested as real by his omnipotence, just like things lying in the dark are brought to view by daylight. Know from here, O Ram, that the whole universe is the network of imagination, and your imagination is the most active power of the mind. Therefore, repress the thickening phantoms of your fleeting fancy and obtain your tranquility by relying solely upon the certainty of the immutable soul of the souls. With this, chapter 101 comes to an end, and in 102 chapter, the indivisibility and immortality of the soul is discussed. Vasishtha is continuing. The ignorant are subject to errors caused by their false fancies, from which the wise are entirely free. By imagining and attributing perishable properties to the imperishable soul, the ignorant beguile themselves like children who take their dolls to be men. Ram replied, what is this imagined perishable property that is imputed to the imperishable soul? Tell me also, greatest of theologians, what misrepresentation misleads the mind to the false conception of the unreal world for a reality? Then Vasishtha replied, the soul, by its continued association with unreal and perishable things, thinks itself to be one of them and takes the title of an unreal and perishable ego. Just like a boy, by association of his thoughts, imagines a false apparition to be a real ghost. All things being situated in one absolute reality, it is hard to account for one's personal ego and to say how and from where this conception became established. In fact, there is no ego except that of the Supreme Soul. Yet, is the nature of the unwise to make a difference between a finite ego and infinite ego, and between a mortal and immortal soul, as if we see two streams of water in the sunbeams of a hot, sandy desert? The mind is a spacious mind in this extensive creation and depends on the Supreme Soul for its support, just like waves depend upon the waters of the sea for their rise and existence. Therefore, O Ram, give up your false view of the reality of the world and your reliance upon the baseless fabric of the universe. Rely with delight upon your judicious view of the true foundation and support of all. Inquire now into the nature of truth with a rational understanding. Being freed from all errors and bias, discard all that is false and untrue. What do you think? That the unconfined soul is confined in the body. It is vain to suppose the infinite soul is confined in any place. To suppose one to be many is to make a division and create a variety in the nature of the Supreme Spirit. Again, the divine essence being diffused alike in all, it cannot be said to be confined in one thing and absent in another. The body being hurt, the soul is supposed to be hurt likewise. But no pain or hurt or sickness of any kind can affect the unchanging soul. The body being hurt or weakened or destroyed, there is no injury done to the soul. Just like a blacksmith's bellows being burned, the wind with which it was filled escapes unconsumed. Whether the body lasts or falls is of no matter to us. Like a flower being destroyed deposits its fragrance in the air. Let any pain or pleasure befall on the body, like dewdrops falling on lotus leaves, it cannot affect us any more than a fading lotus affects or afflicts a flying bee in any manner. Let the body rise or fall or fly in a smoke or mix with the air. These changing forms can have no effect on whatsoever on the soul. The connection of the body with the soul is like between the cloud and the wind, and between the lotus and the bee. If the mind that forms a part of all living bodies is not affected by physical pain, then how is it possible that the primary power of consciousness that resides in the soul can be subject to death? If you know, wise Ram, that the soul is indestructible and inseparable, then what is the need to have sorrow for the supposed separation or disappearance of the all-pervading spirit? After the body is destroyed, the soul flies from it to live in the infinite space of empty air, like wind mixing with air after dispersing clouds, and a bee flying away after the lotus has faded away. The mind is not relaxed with all its enjoyments of life unless it is burned down by the knowledge of truth. Then why speak of the annihilation of the soul? The connection between perishable body and imperishable soul is analogous to that of a vessel and the fruit it holds, and of a pot and the air in it. As a plum is held in the hand or it falls into a pit, so the empty soul is reposed in or deposed from the body. As a pot being broken, its empty part mixes with the air. So the body being dissolved, the soul remains unhurt in empty space. The minds and bodies of living beings are apt to disappear at times from where they live and hide under the shroud of death. Why should we sorrow for such renegades? Seeing the death and disappearance of others, no fool learns to think for himself but fears to die, like all ignorant fools. Therefore renounce, O Ram, your selfish desires and know the falsity of ego. Give up the bond of the body and fly upward. Like a new fledged bird leaves its nest and flies above. It is an act of the mind to lead us to good or evil. It is another function of the mind to fabricate the false fabric of the world, like appearances in a dream. Our incorrigible ignorance stretches out these imageries only for our misery. Our imperfect knowledge shows these falsehoods as realities to us. The mind gives us a dim sight of things as we view the sky hidden by a mist. It is the nature of the mind to have a false view of objects. The dull and unreal world appears as a reality to us. The imaginary duration of the world is like a protracted dream in our sleep. The thought of the idea of the world is the cause of its physical existence. Just as the blinking of eye shows 1,000 disks of sun and moon in the clear sky. Now, Ram, employ your reason to annihilate the physical world from your mind, just as the sun dissolves snow by the heat of his beams. As one wishing to overcome cold gets his object at sunrise, so he who wishes to demolish his mind succeeds at the rise of his reason. As ignorance increases, so it introduces a train of deep-seated errors and evils. It spreads a magic spell around it, just as Samvara, the sorcerer, showed a flux of gold dust about him. The mind, by its worldliness, makes the way to its own destruction and acts the part of its own self-destructive catastrophe by all its acts. The mind wants to preserve itself from destruction, but it is a fool who doesn't know its imminent death. The mind, by its restless desires, hastens itself to a painful death. The reasonable try to avoid restlessness by their government of the mind. The mind that is purified by reason is cleansed from its willingness and unwillingness and resigns itself to the will of the divine soul, which is ever present before it. The curbing of the mind is the magnanimity of soul and gives rise to liberation from pain. Therefore, try to restrain your mind and do not give it a loose rein. The world is a vast wilderness full of the forest of our well-being and sorrow, and beset on all sides by the serpents of disease and death. The rational mind is as the rampant lord of the desert and quickly drives us into all sorts of dangers and difficulties. Now here, the Valmiki ji is speaking. As the sage ended his sermon, the day departed to its end and the sun declined to the west to his evening service. The assembly broke after mutual salutations and met again and greeted each other with the parting night and rising sun. Although it's a very short session, but I will rest today because the sages also have gone to rest and they will meet again. So tomorrow we will meet again by the grace of Lord Ram, and we will continue with our chapter of 23, Utpatti Khanda and the changing mind. Until then, Ch101 friends.